Okay, good. Thursday evening, June the 15th, 2023. You are tuned into the Joseph Benamy Show. I'm your host, Joseph Benamy. Thank you so much for joining. Well, it was a hot one out there today here in Canada's National Capital Region. Actually, more than just the National Capital Region. I'm actually in the city, at an undisclosed location somewhere in the city. But you can still get a hold of me if you want to attack me, call me names. You want to file a human rights complaint against me? No problem. Just go to the website, www.josephbenamy.com, all one word without the hyphen. Send me an email, and I will gladly send you all of my contact coordinates. But nobody wants to take me on. Is it because what I'm saying is unassailable truth? I don't know. I don't have that kind of hubris built into me. I still believe that a little bit of self doubt is a good, healthy thing, contrary to what all of the experts, pseudo experts, I should say, seem to be saying. And that was a completely off the cuff rant for the opening of tonight's show. Tonight, I want to talk about what I call genuine leadership and the lack of genuine leadership that we're suffering from, not just in our country, but throughout Western society as a whole. But before we get into that, let's go over a few of the headlines that caught my eye today that I thought that you might be interested in. To start with, a poll that was conducted by Leger Market Research here in Canada. A majority of Canadians, it's a national poll, side with New Brunswick Premier Blaine Higgs on his gender identity policy in schools. Now, what is that policy? We haven't really reported on it. I think we might have touched on it peripherally about a week ago, but basically what it is this. The Premier of New Brunswick has ordered a change to some of the policies that are in place right now in New Brunswick's public school system that allow for children to express, to demand that they want to change their gender or their gender identity, if that's a more appropriate way of phrasing it, or that they want to use a different pronoun. And as of right now, they don't have to, officials at the school, teachers, don't have to inform parents of this. This change that Premier Higgs wants to bring in would require that parents be informed of what's going on with their children. And there has been a tremendous outcry in New Brunswick, and not just in New Brunswick, it's reached the highest echelons of Canadian politics. The Prime Minister has gone out in public on record and criticized the Premier of New Brunswick. Every left-wing radical trans organization has vilified the Premier, and it's gotten to the point where there has even been a mini caucus revolt by pseudo-conservatives, conservative wannabes, people who call themselves conservative because it's a nice way to get elected in a province where people might vote conservative out of brand loyalty. But ultimately, they don't want to do anything conservative. They're afraid. And I understand them being afraid because it takes some tough skin and leadership, and that's what we're going to get into tonight, in order to push some of these things through. In any event, back to the poll, ladies and gentlemen, 57% of respondents agree that schools should have to tell parents about their child's desire to change their gender or their pronouns. That was a national poll. Less than 1/5, 18% of respondents, felt that schools shouldn't have to tell parents. Now, those are very large numbers, and it's a very good indication that society is rejecting the radical agenda of the trans community when it comes to this stuff. I'm not saying that people shouldn't do what they want to do. I don't really care what goes on in the bedrooms of people. Whether I agree with it or not, it's not my business. But when it comes to children, that becomes my business. It becomes your business as well. And the majority of Canadians, the overwhelming majority of Canadians, agree that parents have a right to know and that schools have a duty to keep parents informed about these issues as they pertain to their children. Here's a headline that caught my eye. The Supreme Court, according to the Toronto Star, the Supreme Court, by the way, this is an exact quote, okay? Supreme Court preserves law that aims to keep Native American children with tribal families. Now, when I read that headline, I thought to myself, what in heaven's name is our Supreme Court here in Canada, the Toronto Star, adjudicating a case that deals with Native American children adoptions? It doesn't make sense to me. So I read on, and sure enough, the Supreme Court, that Canada's most circulated newspaper, the Toronto Star, highest circulation in the country, is reporting that the Supreme Court has ruled on this. Of course, it's the U.S. Supreme Court. It's not Canada's Supreme Court, but you wouldn't know it from this headline. And this, the reason I'm bringing this to your attention isn't because the story is particularly interesting. I mean, it's interesting enough, but what really got me on this was how the Toronto Star or any other news organization in this country, in Canada, could report on a Supreme Court decision in any other country without qualifying whose Supreme Court it is. Without that qualifier, it's only natural to assume that we're referring to Canada's Supreme Court, not the U.S. Supreme Court. When I read a story that says Parliament voted, I naturally assume that if it's in the Toronto Star, they're referring to Canada's Parliament, not the UK Parliament. If I read the same headline in the Times of London, then I naturally assume that it's the UK Parliament, not Canada's Parliament. So it's a small thing, but it's this kind of thing that really gets under my skin. It's such lazy journalism. I'm gobsmacked when I read this kind of stuff, and I'm asking myself, did not anybody in the editorial department read this? Like, who actually wrote this headline? Do you understand that you do not live in the United States, you live in Canada? By the way, the piece is an AP piece, the Associated Press. So in fairness, it wasn't a Toronto Star article, but it was a Toronto Star headline. So my advice to the Toronto Star is get your act together. Get your act together. Canadians deserve better. Some sad news tonight out of Manitoba. Apparently a bus carrying seniors to a casino in southern Manitoba collided with a semi-truck this afternoon. 15 seniors confirmed dead already, another 10 or so in hospital. Those numbers could change. It is a absolutely horrific tragedy that's unfolding in real time in Manitoba. And all I could say is that our hearts and our prayers go out to the victims, and everybody else that is if affected by this terrible, horrific accident in Manitoba. The Paul Bernardo prison transfer story keeps getting better and better. We reported here the other day that the Conservative Party under leader Pierre Poilievre is calling for the resignation of Canada's public safety minister, Mr. Mendicino, on the grounds that he knew that the transfer of Paul Bernardo from a maximum security prison to a medium security prison was going to take place. And I wasn't sure when I reported on that I wasn't sure how long advance notice that the minister's office had. It turns out that they had a memo from Corrections Canada detailing this proposed prison transfer sometime at the beginning of March. I believe it was March the 2nd, which would mean they had it for 3 months. 3 months. Now, again, I don't want to say that the minister himself did something wrong, that he personally knew about this and shrugged his shoulders. I like to think that if he had known about it, he probably would have stepped in and said to prison officials, hold the phone, let's take a look at this. But he didn't. And I'm sure that he's probably not lying when he says he didn't know about it. There was clearly a breakdown in communication in the minister's office. That said, it's still grounds for the minister to step down. He should resign. It's called ministerial responsibility. It may be that somebody on the staff screwed up, and it may be that whoever on the staff who screwed up is going to pay some penalty. I don't know. But for the minister to say it's somebody on my staff, it wasn't me, and to just stonewall and not take responsibility for some kind of an egregious error committed on his watch, even if he's not the person actually responsible, for him to refuse to do that is absolutely wrong. Ministerial responsibility counts. On a related note, that Mark Holland, the Liberal House leader, says that Corrections Canada, the correctional system, has to remain apolitical. I'm not really sure what that means. Is he suggesting that our elected members, our minister, shouldn't have some kind of a say over the conduct of officials in the ministry he oversees? If we've reached the point where that is possible, then I would say we have to take another look at how we're allowing the bureaucrats to run the show. That's not the way it's supposed to work in a democracy. And I understand that you don't want things to become too politicized, but in the final analysis, we elect our leaders to lead, and we expect them to make decisions. If they don't make decisions, who do we hold accountable for policies that we agree with or don't agree with? Ministers have to be able to intervene when it's appropriate to intervene. And in this case, it was entirely appropriate for the minister to intervene. Boris Johnson. Okay, flipping over to international news. Boris Johnson, the report is out, and it is scathing. As you know, we reported earlier this week that Boris Johnson had resigned his seat in the UK House of Commons, former Prime Minister, and he did so after having the opportunity to review an advance copy of the study, the report, investigating his conduct in what has come to be known as Partygate. Very briefly, during the height of the COVID lockdowns in Great Britain, there were a number of social functions, parties, if you will, that were held in government offices, including in the Prime Minister's office, including a birthday party for the Prime Minister. Boris Johnson was the Prime Minister at the time. And at that time, all of the regulations apparently that were being imposed on average citizens in the UK were being broken by government officials, including ministers of the Crown. And in fact, there were a lot of fines that were given out by the Metropolitan Police as a consequence of these particular gatherings. Boris Johnson at first denied that they happened and then admitted that they happened, but talked about how he didn't know. He thought that he understood that the rules were being followed, etc., etc. The details here don't really matter. What matters is that the all-committee report, with a majority, by the way, of members on that committee are Conservative Party members, Boris Johnson's party. They wrote a report and basically found him guilty, of misleading Parliament, which would have and they were recommending a minimum 10-day suspension from Parliament as a punishment for this. But they also claim that Boris Johnson and his associates, colleagues, close friends, engaged in a campaign of intimidation, both against witnesses that were being examined by the committee and committee members themselves. And as a consequence of that, rather than a 10-day suspension, the committee recommended a 90-day suspension. It is a huge, huge thing. Anyway, Boris Johnson has resigned. He resigned it before the report was made public. And now, of course, there's a whole rigmarole going on in Great Britain around this. Johnson himself is saying that the committee's findings were deranged, quote unquote, and he has supporters still in the House of Commons, and the House has to vote to accept or reject this report. And it looks like a number of his supporters are going to, in a debate, argue against it and vote against it. And not healthy for the governing party, which is already suffering in the polls, the Conservative Party. And they're just going to continue to tear one another apart on this particular thing. Of course, we'll talk a little bit about in the next segment what's going on here, Boris Johnson and that. We've touched on it in previous shows, but I really want to drill down on all of this, because what we're witnessing, I think, is a failure of leadership. But let's set that aside right now. Let's hit the pause button and let's go for our first break of the evening. So stay tuned. We'll be back in a couple of minutes here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show. And we are back. You are tuned into the Joseph Benamy Show for Thursday, June the 15th, 2023. I'm your host, Joseph Benamy. Thank you so much for staying with us. All right. I want to talk tonight about leadership. And going back to the previous segment, there were a number of stories that demonstrate a lack of leadership. The Boris Johnson story, for one. I think the Paul Bernardo story, minister refusing to step down, blaming his staff for problems in the minister's office, refusing to step down, and contrasting that with Premier Higgs in New Brunswick, who, in the face of serious, concerted, organized opposition, is continuing to stand on principle and is willing to risk his political future to defend what he thinks is the right thing to do. And what is that? That is simply that parents have the right to be informed by school officials if their children express a desire at school to change gender or to change their preferred pronouns. I don't know whether or not I'm using the right terminology. Please, nobody think that I'm in favor or against based on the terminology I'm using, okay? It's become so bloody confusing, I gotta tell you. So the point I'm making here is that the Premier is willing to put his political future on the line to defend the principle of parental consent, parental responsibility, parental rights. And more than parental rights, parental obligations. The obligation to raise our children is first and foremost a parental obligation. The obligation to educate the children is first and foremost a parental obligation. And this is the right thing to do. And this is an example of real leadership. Real leadership. Leading the way in the face of opposition. And leading from the front, not from the back. In contrast to this, we see the minister here federally in charge of prisons, who apparently his office had been told 3 months before the move was made, or the decision was made to move Paul Bernardo from a maximum security prison to a medium security prison. 3 months he had that information in his office, and nobody did anything about it. And his response is, it's not me, it's my staff. And we'll take measures against my staff. I haven't heard him actually say that latter part, that they're going to take measures against the staff, but it just stands to reason. It's not me, it's my staff. Well, that's an example of what good leaders don't do. Good leaders take responsibility for the performance of their team. The minister gets to choose his team in his office. These are not bureaucrats that were appointed that worked their way up the ladder. His team is hand-selected, if not by him personally, by his chief of staff, who was hand-selected by him. When it comes to a good team, good teamwork, good leaders don't point fingers. Good leaders take responsibility for the performance of their team. If the team doesn't do well, the leader may indeed work within the team behind closed doors to improve performance. But outside of that locker room, if I want to use a sports analogy, outside of the locker room, good leaders don't blame their teammates. They don't blame the team. They take responsibility. They take the heat. We used to have, in this country, the principle of ministerial responsibility. Meaning that, as I've just said about team leaders taking responsibility for the performance of their team, of individuals on their team, that was embedded in this principle of ministerial responsibility, where ministers would resign irrespective of whether they personally had done something wrong because of the failures in their team, and not just failures in their own team, as in the minister's own personal staff, but failures within the department itself. Now, it's really critically important for that in the smooth and effective functioning of democracy. Because in the final analysis, ladies and gentlemen, we have to be able to hold our elected officials responsible for the performance of the departments that are under their care. We cannot fire the department. We cannot fire the bureaucracy. We have ministers and minister staff that are responsible for ensuring the proper, efficient, effective operation of the ministry under their care, under their jurisdiction, on our behalf. And if things are going wrong, we expect ministers and their staff to fix the problems. And when problems are not fixed, it is the responsibility of the minister. It's like being the captain of a ship. I'm not saying the captain of the ship goes down with the ship. We don't believe in that tradition. But what we do believe is that the captain of the ship is responsible for the performance of the ship. Ministerial responsibility. Don't blame other people. That's not what good leaders do. And then we have the example of Boris Johnson. I like Boris Johnson. I don't know him personally, but I kind of have always liked his, he's kind of like a friendlier Donald Trump. That's probably a good way to describe him. He's not as caustic and confrontational as Donald Trump is, but he's a little outside the box in terms of how he performs his duties. You have to take him with a bit of a grain of salt. He's a bit of an acquired taste, but I like him. I like him a lot. Always have. And I am very disappointed. I was very disappointed in Boris Johnson when I learned of what was going on around this so-called Partygate scandal. This is another thing that good leaders never do. Good leaders never allow themselves to be treated better than the people that they lead. Now, they may make a little bit more money. They may have a bigger office. They may get better accolades when things are going well. This is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about when you're imposing hardships on the people that you lead, because sometimes the leader has to impose hardship in order to accomplish whatever the mission is of the team. Sometimes the leader has to ask team members to make sacrifices. And when that happens, it's really important that team leaders do not demand more sacrifice, more hardship in pursuit of a mission than they themselves are prepared to accept on themselves. What happened with this Partygate stuff? What happened with Partygate is simply this. We reported on this previously, but I want to go over it quickly one more time. The government of the United Kingdom passed regulations and laws in reaction to the whole COVID scare, requiring that citizens do not congregate, do not have events. They stay at home. They have to follow all of these rules. Essentially, it shut down the country. And we had the same thing here in Canada. And we saw in many of the states in the United States the same thing as well. Rules that basically said you can't have family gatherings. If a close family member happens to, God forbid, die, you can't have a funeral. We'll bury the person, sure, but you can't have a family gathering. You can't celebrate Easter together as a family. You can't celebrate Thanksgiving as a family. You can't celebrate Christmas as a family. We had law enforcement officers in some jurisdictions who would go up and actually look in the windows of people's private houses to see on Thanksgiving or Christmas how many people were actually gathered at that location. We had situations where if father and son were playing pickup hockey on a local frozen pond together, they were stopped, they were apprehended, and they were charged with violating the COVID rules. Now, whether it was quite that restrictive or not in the UK is beside the point. The fact is, there were major restrictions, and Boris Johnson and his people violated those rules. That's for the great unwashed. For us, we know better. We're okay. And it wasn't just Boris Johnson. We saw the same thing happen here in Canada. The same thing happening in the United States. Remember the pictures of Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, in the midst of a lockdown in California, having a large party in a restaurant when nobody else was allowed to go anywhere? Even here in Canada, the Premier of Alberta, at that time, same thing. That's a failure of leadership, ladies and gentlemen. Good leaders never demand greater sacrifice, greater hardship in pursuit of a mission than they themselves are prepared to impose on themselves. Good leaders make sure that their team, their followers, are fed first before they eat. They make sure that their followers have a decent place to sleep before they go to sleep. That's what leadership is all about, and more, but those are basic characteristics of good leaders. Let's take a couple of minutes break. We'll be back again in 2.5 minutes here on the Joseph Bannerman Show. Please stay with us.
just a feeling that this might be right for us, for you and me. There is just a look I think this might be right for us, for you and me. There is just a feeling that this might be right for us, for you and me. There is just a look I think this might be right for us, for you and me.
Okay, we are back here on the Joseph Banamy Show. It is Thursday, June the 15th, 2023. I am your host, Joseph Banamy. If you're just joining us, thanks for joining. And if you are staying with us, thank you so much for doing that too. We are talking about leadership as a particular subject. And you know, we're looking everywhere for leadership. If I had to say the one thing that's the most lacking in our world today, in Western civilization, the Western part of the world, it's leadership on so many levels. You know, I sometimes get accused of being part of a reactionary crowd. And I admit that often the kinds of positions that I take, the arguments that I make, are in reaction. They're reactionary arguments for sure. But the thing about reactionary arguments is that they are reacting to something. And this is another very important, crucial element of good leadership. In today's society, and this is not something that's limited just to the left, although it's more dominant on the left, it's more prevalent on the left, the temptation to dismiss the position of people who do not agree with you, and worse than that, to act as a dictator towards them, to try to beat them silly until they succumb to whatever your particular vision is. Now, good leadership requires vision, I think. But vision, good leaders sell their vision, and they respect the fact that there are people out there that don't agree with their vision. Unfortunately, we see now time and time again where governments, elected governments in our democratic society, are taking the powers that are in their hands, that are entrusted to them, and using the power of the government as a blunt instrument to force people to agree with them. And that's a very big mistake, ladies and gentlemen. That is a recipe for civil strife. At some point in time, I'm amazed, given the depth of the rhetoric and everything that's been going on, particularly south of the border here in the United States, the polarization, the extreme language that's used, and what can only be characterized as the weaponization of the Department of Justice in the United States. We see it here in dribs and drabs a little bit here in Canada, but we don't see it anywhere near on the magnitude that we're seeing it in the United States. That is dangerous. And it's dangerous irrespective of what side you're on. Because, ladies and gentlemen, there are a lot of people in a free society who are not going to agree with what you want to accomplish as the leader. And good leadership, ladies and gentlemen, let me give you a definition, a standard definition of leadership. Leadership is the art of influencing people's attitudes and behavior in order to get them to assist in accomplishing whatever the goal is of the leader. That's a pretty good definition of leadership. We're not talking about coercing people. Essentially, we're talking about persuading people. Now, there may be a time, in very limited circumstances, where some element of coercion is required. But right now, what we're seeing in the Western world, in the Western society, is a reliance on coercion. Now, as I said, that is predominantly something that you see emanating from the left of the political spectrum. Cancel culture. We've all heard of this. And if you're a conservative, you have very grave concerns about the canceling, the deplatforming of people who are expressing conservative views, like Premier Higgs in New Brunswick here in Canada, on the issue of parents being informed about what their children want with respect to gender identity and pronouns while they're in public school. So you have to be able to persuade people and not deplatform your opposition. But I think it's important to make note of the fact that we ourselves, who are conservatives, are leaning into that as well. We're becoming more like our opponents. We're not quite there yet in magnitude. But I know very well, from personal experience, that even amongst conservatives, amongst conservative groups, there is a tendency now to say we don't want to hear the other side. And if you're going to give any kind of brook to the other side, if you're going to say, let's pause and listen so that we understand what they're saying, if you have the temerity to do that, I know from personal experience that you're going to be ostracized by people on the right as well. As I say, it's not that prevalent on the right, but it's there, and it's growing, and it's very troublesome. Because conservatism is not supposed to be that dogmatic. There are a lot of people out there today who call themselves conservatives that are not really conservatives. And when somebody says, let's hit the pause button and think about what you're saying and what your policy is, what your ideas are, why you're opposing this particular policy, etc., let's have a debate, a discussion, and try to understand, and including understanding the point of view of those who don't agree with us, that's healthy. That's healthy, and I think that's part of being a good conservative. But if you're going to do that, you have to be prepared to be subjected to the same kind of opprobrium that, as a conservative, you're subjected to from the left. Again, not as prevalent. And that's bad leadership, ladies and gentlemen. Good leaders want to hear what opponents are saying. Why? Because good leaders understand that they don't know everything. That maybe they've forgotten something, they've overlooked something. Maybe your opponents have interesting ideas that might be able to be enlisted as a means of helping you achieve your goals. Maybe the goals of your opponents are closer to your own goals. And in political leadership, as Ronald Reagan once put it, 80% of a loaf is a heck of a lot better than no loaf at all. And so good leadership requires working hard to maintain good relations with everybody, particularly when it comes to governing. But we see more and more polarization, and that's bad leadership. Good leaders resist polarization. Good leaders insist on hearing everybody out, then making a decision. That's good leadership. And good leaders rely on persuasion, on making the case. And ultimately, when we live in a free and democratic society, good political leadership also involves sometimes finding compromises. Understanding that there are a lot of people in this country who don't agree with you, and that you have to find ways to achieve things in an incremental way. Now, that doesn't mean I'm an incrementalist per se, but sometimes you have to make compromises. The criticism that I would have of the performance of conservative parties in government in the past is that they really haven't been incremental in terms of implementing a conservative policy agenda. Incrementalism has really amounted to, in that context, a slower move to the left as opposed to a slow move to the right. And that's my criticism there. The final thing, and I want to stress this, is you have to have some vision. It's not good enough to just be against what your political opponents are in favor of. You have to have a clear vision and the courage to articulate that vision clearly and in a manner that's going to inspire people to want to follow. And that is absolutely missing from the conservative world today. What we don't have is we don't have a vision of what it means to be a conservative, and more importantly, what it means to be a country that is being led by a genuinely conservative government. If you don't have that vision, if you don't have a clear identity, then you leave yourself open to your political opponents deciding what your vision is and what your identity is. And I can guarantee you that your political opponents are not going to be as favorable in their characterization of what you want to achieve as you might be. So that is another very important element of political leadership. Respect for your political opponents, respect for their ideas, but having the courage to say when you disagree and why you disagree, and if it means putting your career on the line, as someone like Premier Higgs in New Brunswick here in Canada has said he's prepared to do. He said he's prepared to call an election on this issue of parental rights alone. And if he calls that election, he'll probably win. The question, of course, is will he have the support of his own colleagues who are wishy-washy on the issues themselves? That's a bigger question. I don't have an answer to it. I'm not going to even attempt to answer that question. So leadership, ladies and gentlemen, we need good leaders. Good leaders who act with integrity, good leaders who understand loyalty to their supporters and loyalty to their opponents. Good leaders who understand that they have to master the art of persuasion and not constantly rely on coercion. Good leaders with vision, with compassion, with courage, with strength of character. All of these things combine to make good leaders, and that, my friends, is what we need in Canada today, in the Western world, particularly when it comes to the conservative side of the political aisle. Let's take our final break. We'll be back in a couple of minutes here on the Joseph Benamy Show. And we are back. Thanks for sticking with us. You are tuned in to the Joseph Benamy Show for Thursday, June the 15th, 2023. I am your host, Joseph Benamy. You know, an hour just seems to go by so quickly. And just during the break, I was just taking a look at some of the news items, particularly because I was interested in seeing if there was an update on the events in not New Brunswick, but Manitoba, where there was this horrific bus accident where 15 seniors apparently have perished on their way to would have been a fun-filled event at a casino, and nothing new. But as I was scrolling through the news, I came across this item about a new contract, tentative agreement between the longshoremen and management that, if it's ratified, will stave off a general strike in the ports. And that would be catastrophic for Canada's economy, I think, if it was allowed to happen. But according to the Wall Street Journal, it looks like the pay raise that the longshoremen will be getting is somewhere in the order of 32%. Now, I don't really know all of the details of this, and we'll have to get into it next week when we come back, but 32%, that's going to add to the price of imports for sure, and exports. So one more item that contributes to inflation. It's not all government policy. And my goodness gracious, that's quite a hefty hike. So as I say, I don't really know the details of the agreement, but if true, that is a lot of money. And also something that's very interesting is some of the artificial intelligence stuff that's going on. There was a story that I didn't get into today about apparently creating a synthetic embryo has been successfully created, human embryo. We'll talk a little bit about that probably next week sometime. Today's Thursday. Obviously, it's the last day of the week for me. You can join Nick Vandergrat and I on Out of Control with Nick and Joe on Sunday night on YouTube. And what else could go on next week? Housekeeping. I am not going to be here on Tuesday, so we will not be having a show on Tuesday next week. That I believe is the 20th. That's correct. Tuesday, June the 20th. I have a minor medical procedure that I have to have taken care of that day, and I probably won't be up to doing the show because we do this live. We don't do it live to tape. It's not edited or anything like that. So we will not be broadcasting next Tuesday night. All right. Well, I'm conscious of the time here. No updates yet from CRTC about the status of their hearings and any decision that they've made or not made, their deliberations on Fox News Network being available or continuing to be available here in Canada on Canadian cable channels, Canadian cable providers, I should say. And again, as soon as we know something about that, we will certainly be passing that information on to you. What else is happening? Okay, well, look, check out the website, www.josephbenamy. If you're listening to the podcast, by the way, that's JOSEPHBENAMI. So it's all one word, .com without the hyphen. And while you're there, you'll see I have an interesting column that I posted yesterday talking a little bit about some of the arguments that we made on yesterday night's show about mistakes in the scientific community in interpreting data. So you'll want to check that out. And while you're there, you'll want to check out previous shows. They're all there on our podcast. You don't have to listen to it on the computer. You can listen to them on your handheld device, whatever you do. And you can get your podcast, my podcast, on pretty much all of the major podcast distributors, platforms. Okay, so one last thing. If you want to get a hold of me, please just send me an email. Use the contact form on the website. I do read all of my emails. Maybe someday, I will be so popular and so famous that I'll have to hire staff to help me sort through them. But I am not in that position right now. And quite frankly, I'm not sure I want to be in that position, because I like interacting with people one-on-one, even if it's through email. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for joining me tonight and for joining me throughout the week. I appreciate it. Once again, check out the website, www.josephbenamy, all one word without the hyphen. And we will see you on Monday night here on the Joseph Ben-Ami Show, where we speak truth to power and anyone else who will listen.